Scotland, the evening of 10th of May 1941. The most extraordinary event of the Second World War is underway. Hitler's deputy, Rudolf Hess, parachutes into a Scottish field. He has flown single-handed from Germany. He brings a plan for peace and expects to meet members of a British peace party eager to end the war. Instead, he is taken prisoner. Within hours, Hitler would denounce him as a madman. Both Churchill and Hitler would declare that he had acted alone. But was he mad? Did he act alone? Or was Rudolf Hess the key player in a daring plan to appeal to the king, overthrow Churchill, and take Britain out of the war? Britain awoke to hear that Hitler's deputy had flown from Germany with a plan to end the war. But for Rudolf Hess, this extraordinary mission was merely the final leg of a long journey. A journey that had begun 20 years earlier in a Germany decimated by defeat. The First World War left its mark on Hess. Like Hitler, he was wounded in the chest by a sniper's bullet, but recovered to train as a fighter pilot. After the war, he enrolled at Munich University. The city, like the rest of the once mighty Reich, was in crisis. The Versailles peace terms had humiliated Germany. Held responsible for war debts which it could never pay, the country fell into economic ruin. Inflation and disorder followed. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, Nazi for short, was the loudest voice against the Versailles settlement. Hess began to attend meetings where members raged against the traitors of Versailles, the Bolsheviks, and an economy run by the Jews. At one of these meetings, Hess saw Hitler.
You first saw him on a rally in 1920, and he changed completely after first hearing Hitler. He was happy and told my mother that he had seen the man who is going to restore Germans' importance.
In 1923, with inflation running out of control and the fear of a communist uprising, Hitler attempted to seize power in Munich. With Hess and others, he marched into a city beer hall. Firing their revolvers into the roof, they announced that the revolution had begun. This Beer Hall Putsch ended in shambles, and first Hitler and then Hess were arrested and imprisoned in the fortress of Landsberg. Here they spent their days setting down a vision of how the Reich could be reborn as a world power.
Hitler wrote during this period his book Mein Kampf, and he used my father as a devil's advocate, and in reading pieces of what he has written to my father and asking for his opinion.
Mein Kampf, My Struggle, explained how a new Reich could rise from the ashes of the old. It argued that all true Germans belonged to the Aryan race, which must now expand eastwards and become the greatest power in Europe. The Jews were the great enemy of the Aryan race and had helped the Bolsheviks gain power in Russia. To defeat Bolshevism and establish the new Germany, the Jews must be destroyed. Life in the Landsberg turned out to be a pleasant affair for Hitler and Hess. The relaxed regime allowed visits from friends. One of Hess's most frequent visitors was Karl Haushofer, his professor from university days. Despite his having a Jewish wife, he and Hess became close friends. Haushofer was involved in a new area of research which would focus on the relationship between people and the land in which they lived. It was called geopolitics. He argued that the people of Germany needed more room to live, or Lebensraum. Hess had been entranced by this theory, which now found its way into Mein Kampf, and would provide Hitler with the justification to attack Russia and its Jewish Bolshevism. After the war, Haushofer was interrogated by the Allies and asked if Hitler had learned his ideas of Lebensraum from Hess.
Those ideas came from Hess to Hitler, but he didn't understand them. Whenever Hess tried to explain them to Hitler, Hitler usually came up with one of his new ideas about an autobahn or anything else which had nothing to do with it.
Isn't it true that Hess collaborated with Hitler in writing Mein Kampf?
As far as I know, Hess actually dictated many chapters of that book, yes.
The bond between Hitler and Hess was strengthened by their time in the Landsberg prison. From then until 1933, when Hitler became German Chancellor, and through the early years of Nazi rule, Hess was by the Führer's side, the conscience of the party.
He also played a key role at the Nuremberg rallies in welcoming Hitler. He built up the enthusiasm of the audience so that Hitler could be introduced at a time in which he could get maximum support.
Die Partei ist Hitler! Hitler aber ist Deutschland, wie Deutschland Hitler ist! Hitler siegt! Siegt!
The bond was not just political, but personal. Hitler became godfather to Hess's son, named Wolf, after Hitler's own nickname during the early days of Nazism.
You must know that my father and Hitler, they had a special relationship, I would call it. But people tell that he only flew to England in order to restore his position is absolutely nonsense, because the position with Hitler was always very good.
Rudolf Hess was of particular significance in the very early days because he was extremely close to Hitler as his bodyguard, as his secretary, and because he was regarded as totally loyal, Hitler gave him great responsibility and gave him the charge and control of the Nazi Party, which was a position of very considerable power within Germany at that time.
For Hess, peace with Britain was vital if Germany was to drive east and win both Lebensraum and the destruction of Bolshevik Russia. The outbreak of war in 1939 changed everything. Britain was now the enemy, and although Germany had signed an agreement with Russia, Hitler was drawing up secret invasion plans. By 1941, he was ready to strike. Hess was horrified at the prospect of a war on two fronts. If only Britain could be persuaded that peace was in her interest. He had reason to believe there was still a chance. A section of British society had gone to war reluctantly. Many landowners, together with financiers in the City of London, feared there would be no winners in this war. They reckoned that Britain and Germany would fight themselves to a standstill. The British Empire would disintegrate, leaving the military might of Russia and the industrial strength of the United States to dominate the world. To this exclusive social set, the great enemy was not Germany, but Bolshevik Russia.
Before the war, there was a very strong pro-German, pro-fascist, pro-Hitler movement in Britain, beginning right up the top with the Duke of Windsor. And including, two organizations, the Link, which had two dukes, the Duke of Bedford and the Duke of Westminster as members, and the Anglo-German Fellowship, which had people like, well, chairman of ICI, the chief policy advisor of the Foreign Office, and something like 15 or 16 peers of the realm belonging to it.
Stalin's Russia was also seen as the main enemy by the British Secret Intelligence Service, or SIS. They too were keen to explore possibilities for peace.
SIS were making all these peace moves with the Germans. A representative of SIS met a representative of Goering after the war had started in Switzerland. There were moves through the Vatican, there were moves in Sweden. There were all these little intrigues going on, largely led by SIS.
But if Hess was to take advantage of these peace moves, he needed a point of contact in Britain. He turned for advice to Albrecht Haushofer, the son of his old teacher, Karl. Albrecht had built up a large network of friendships throughout Europe, which Hess now sought to exploit.
He knew that Albrecht, although an official in the German government, had external links to organisations like the Red Cross and foreign embassies, and he had also made contact before the war with members of the ruling class and the ruling elite in Britain.
One member of that ruling elite living in Scotland and a friend of Haushofer's before the war was the Duke of Hamilton. The Duke was a wing commander in the Royal Air Force, leading a fighter wing based in Scotland and in charge of fighter defence for the area. He and his 3 brothers all commanded RAF squadrons. He had made history by being the first man to fly over Everest, and in his aerial exploits, Hess felt he had found a kindred spirit.
My father had fairly recently flown over Everest, which was over 29,000 feet. Hess had, in a slightly smaller way, won a thing called the Zugspitze race, which is the race around Germany's highest mountain, which is just short of 10,000 feet. And I think Hess felt that one of the advantages of going to see my father was that they would speak as man-to-man, pilot-to-pilot, about, I think in Hess's view, how the war might most satisfactorily be ended.
But it was more than mere flying skill that marked the Duke out. In October 1939, 1 month after war had been declared, he had sent a letter to the Times in which he stated that the Versailles settlement had been unfair to Germany. He wrote, "I look forward to the day when a trusted Germany will again come into her own. That day may be far off, but when it comes, then hostilities could and should cease." This sympathy for the German people was underlined by his friendship with Albrecht Haushofer, who had stayed with him at his Scottish country seat, Dungavel House. Hess now played on this pre-war friendship, persuading Haushofer to write to the Duke of Hamilton, urging a meeting in neutral Lisbon. But the letter was intercepted by RAF intelligence. There was no reply. However, Hess had cast his net much wider than Britain. Haushofer had also been instructed to open a channel to the British ambassador in Madrid, Samuel Hoare, who was known to favour a compromise peace. In late April 1941, just 2 weeks before his flight, there were reports that Hess himself was in Spain.
We think that Haushofer and Hoare did meet. We think that Hess might have been there, and a Labour MP called Sidney Silverman actually stood up in the House of Commons and said that he knew that Rudolf Hess had gone to Spain to get involved in talks with representatives of people in Britain who were interested in doing a peace deal with Germany.
Whatever was said in Spain seems to have convinced Hess to forge ahead. His plans were now well advanced. Several months earlier, he had persuaded Willy Messerschmitt, his friend and Germany's top aircraft designer, to provide him with a brand new Me-110, a 2-seater fighter bomber, which he had been learning to fly single-handed. Soon, he would fly alone to Britain to meet Haushofer's friend, the Duke of Hamilton, and, he believed, through him, men who would be willing to talk peace and overthrow Churchill. Bad weather delayed Hess's plans to make the long flight to Scotland, but by May 1941 he was ready, and the forecast was good.
He was a very keen pilot, and he won the so-called Zugspitzflug. And there's a telegram from Hitler saying, giving congratulations to him and saying, "I hope that your flying ambitions are now fulfilled." Because Hitler wasn't very fond of my father flying around.
At the same time, Hess's trusted aide, Ernst Bohler, translated a letter from Hess to the Duke of Hamilton into English. Interrogated after the war, Bohler was convinced that Hess was not planning his flight behind Hitler's back.
I hadn't the vaguest idea that he was flying to England. Otherwise, I would have told him it was a wild idea. And it was my firm opinion at the time, which I cannot prove to the one side or the other today, that Hitler knew all about it, because it seemed impossible to me that Hess would do anything of such importance without asking Hitler.
I'm convinced that Hitler and my father discussed this flight. My father always maintained that it was his personal idea, but there are a lot of indications that Hitler knew. For example, that they both talked on the 3rd of May, so very few days before the flight together in Berlin about 4 hours. No, we don't know what they talked, but we only know that the voices went up and down, and when they were finished, they came out of the room, and the police officer of my father who attended him told that Hitler had his arm around the shoulder of my father and said, "Hess, you have always been and will be a very stubborn man." So I don't believe that they were only talking about the weather.
On the morning of Saturday, the 10th of May, 1941, Hess said goodbye to Ilse and his son Wolf. He was going on a trip, but would be back on Monday. Around 6 o'clock, he took off from the airfield at Augsburg on a course that would pass over Hamilton's house at Dungavel in Scotland. Behind him, he left a letter for Hitler. His wife said it closed with the words,
"And if, my Führer, this project ends in failure, simply say, I was crazy."
His plane was fitted with long-range fuel tanks to enable him to reach the northern coast of Britain some 900 miles away. He flew at very low level to avoid the radar, but his aircraft was spotted by an observer post on the ground. How he avoided being shot down has become part of the Hess mystery. Several British fighters were scrambled to intercept and would have attacked had they made contact. Aware that he was being hunted and struggling to find his bearings, Hess knew that there was no alternative to bailing out. In a letter to his wife, Ilse, he relived the moment.
I unbuckled my harness, opened the canopy, and tried to climb out. It was impossible. The air pressure pressed me so hard against my seat that it was as if I had been welded to it. Of all the things I had innocently asked my fine Messerschmitt people, I had never once asked how to bail out. Then I remembered I had once heard that one must turn the plane upside down and fall out. I began to roll the plane over. Then everything turned black and I passed out. I was unconscious at the controls and racing towards the ground. I suddenly came round, as if by magic. I slid out. A split second later, the plane dropped like a stone. I pulled the parachute ripcord, the straps tightened, and I began to float. An indescribably wonderful and victorious feeling.
Hess had crashed to earth at Eaglesham in southern Scotland. In bailing out, he had struck the Messerschmitt's tail and chipped a bone in his ankle. And his welcoming party consisted not of leaders of the British establishment, but of local ploughman David McLean. Hess gave McLean a false name, claiming to be Hauptmann Alfred Horn, but stressed that he had an important message for the Duke of Hamilton. Astonishingly, Hess was interviewed first not by the Army or Secret Service, but in a local scout hut by the Polish consul from Glasgow. They spoke in German, which no one else present understood. A list was made of his possessions. These included a Leica camera, a map, photographs, and some visiting cards belonging to the Haushofers. There may also have been the letter to the Duke of Hamilton, which Bowler had translated. We can only guess, as the list itself has disappeared.
My father came home and he was in a state of some excitement, and he said he couldn't stay long because a nasty Nazi had landed fairly nearby, and he was going to go and see the nasty Nazi and also his aeroplane. He left with me calling after him, "Bring me back a bit of aeroplane, please, Daddy." And he did. He said he would, and he did. And it's here. And I was really very upset about it because I was expecting to get a nice big tail fin with a swastika on it or something of the sort. However, I made the best of it. And about 2 days later, two sort of archetypal Secret Service men turned up wearing those funny trilby hats and odd, I remember them very distinctly, odd raincoats with the splits up the back. And they said, "What are you doing with this piece of equipment?" And I said, "My daddy gave it to me and it belonged to a Nazi. And they said, "Well, you've no business to have it, it's not yours." And they took it away.
Hess had been taken overnight to the local barracks, where Hamilton now arrived to see him.
The German, who was then in bed with a chipped ankle, said to my father, "I don't know whether you know who I am, but my name is Rudolf Hess. I'm Hitler's deputy, and I'm here on a personal, unauthorized mission of humanity." And he then went on to explain that the peace offer he was making was a free hand to Britain in the empire, provided only that Germany should have a free hand in Europe and the East.
Hess clearly didn't regard the Duke as his jailer, and even gave him some of his personal effects for safekeeping.
He had a Leica camera with him, which he gave to my father and said, "Will you look after this for me?" And my father passed it on to my mother to use, and she took some wonderful pictures throughout the rest of the war, and right up to about 1950, when I think she got an attack of conscience about it and sent it back to Mrs. Hess.
Satisfied the prisoner was Hess, the Duke rang the Foreign Office to report. But while he was on the phone, Churchill's private secretary, Jock Colville, came on the line. Hamilton told him that something extraordinary had happened, like something out of a fantasy novel. Colville asked, "Has someone arrived?" Later, he would claim that this remark had been prompted by a dream the night before, in which he had imagined that Hitler had parachuted into England. An unlikely explanation, and the first indication that the flight may not have come as a complete surprise to Churchill. Hamilton set off to see him, flying down in his own Hurricane fighter plane.
He was greeted by Winston Churchill in tremendous spirits, and my father told him his story. And Churchill said, "Do you mean to tell me that the Deputy Führer of Germany is in our hands?" And my father said, "Well, that is who he said he was." And Churchill looked at him as though he was having hallucinations and that the war was too much for him. And he said, "Well, Hess or no Hess, I am going to see the Marx Brothers." And they went out to see the film next door.
While Churchill relaxed, Hess was transferred to the military hospital at Buchanan Castle near Loch Lomond. There, Robert Shaw was the young lieutenant in charge of the guard.
I started asking questions. I said, "Did you know the Duke of Hamilton?" Oh, he said, "I've met him. I met him at the Olympic Games in '36.
Meanwhile, Churchill had ordered Hamilton back to Scotland, together with Yvonne Kirkpatrick of the Foreign Office, who had known Hess while at the British Embassy in Berlin. Shaw was asked to leave while they talked to Hess.
They were there for about 3 hours. And being curious as to what was happening, I had a little shaving mirror, which I put above the door to see what was going on. And it was a very animated conversation. Hess was really quite, not aggressive, but very firm in what he was saying. And this was a very straight talking session between Kirkpatrick and Hess, particularly. And when they came out of the room, the Duke it was said to me, "You know who your prisoner is?" And I said, "Yes, I take it it's Hess." He says, "Yes, it is. You must keep him under observation, personal observation, for the rest of the time that you're here. No one must be allowed to speak to him. And when you leave here in the morning, you must not allow yourself to be interviewed by anyone."
The following morning, Shaw had breakfast with Hamilton and Kirkpatrick.
When we were having our meal in the officers' mess, I said to the Duke of Hamilton, "He says he knows you, or he hasn't met you." And the Duke says, "Yes, I did meet him once, and that was in 1936 at the Olympic Games, but we didn't have a friendship."
I'm certain that Hess and my father never met at the Berlin Olympic Games, as some historians have thought. What happened was my father went to the Olympic Games, and he may have been in the same room at the same reception as Hess at the same time on more than one occasion, but they were not introduced to each other, and they did not meet.
News of Hess's flight reached Hitler while he was at his mountain retreat, the Berghof.
Hitler was surprised, not because he didn't expect Hess to go and meet representatives of the British Peace Party, but because he didn't expect him to turn up in Scotland. He certainly did say, when he heard that Hess had turned up, he said, "I can't understand this at all. It doesn't sound like Hess. He must have gone mad."
Hitler ordered a press statement about Hess, broadcast on German radio.
Party member Hess, who has been expressly forbidden by the Führer to use an aeroplane because of a disease which has been getting worse for years, was, in contradiction of this order, able to get hold of a plane recently. A letter which he left behind, unfortunately, showed traces of mental disturbance.
But from Churchill, there was merely a puzzling silence. Hitler's propaganda chief, Goebbels, could hardly believe that Britain had failed to exploit Hess's capture. The prisoner had not been paraded for the newspapers and newsreels.
It seems that London has not hit upon the idea of simply issuing statements in Hess's name without his knowledge. This is the big, most alarming danger as far as we are concerned. We are dealing with dumb amateurs over there. What we would do if the situation were reversed.
But Churchill was no dumb amateur. The war was going badly for Britain, and he feared that talking about Hess would revive talk of peace.
The only explanation is that there was a powerful group of characters and forces inside British society that Churchill wanted marginalised, and that the only way of marginalising them was by shutting them up and by preventing any discussion or speculation about peace and the possibility of dealing with Germany. And the only way you could do that was by throwing a security blanket over Hess and everything that he stood for.
Churchill's continued silence may have stifled talk of peace, but he couldn't prevent Fleet Street's cartoonists from having their say. The Duke of Hamilton failed to see the joke in any of this. The absence of any statement from Churchill meant his name remained firmly linked to Hess.
My father waited until he went by taxi from Downing Street to Buckingham Palace, and he shared the taxi with the Prime Minister. And he said, "If a prostitute throws her arms around your neck, what do you tell your wife?" And Churchill roared with laughter and said not a word to anyone, but he acted. And almost immediately thereafter, a statement was made by Sir Archie Sinclair, which made it clear that my father had not been in correspondence with Hess and had not met him before the war.
The Duke's worry was well-founded, for the Hess mission fueled suspicions on an international scale.
Stalin demanded of all these spies that he had in Britain at the time, like Philby, Burgess, Maclean, Blunt, what's the true story behind Hess's arrival? He was not the only one suspicious. I mean, President Roosevelt was suspicious as well. When he heard about it, a personal briefing from Churchill himself, he said later on to one of his aides, "I wonder what the real story is behind Hess's arrival."
You have no idea of the rumors in the press and in Washington and, you know, that Britain was going to make a separate peace, that it was going to collapse and make a deal with Hitler. And of course, a lot of this stuff came from the far left and the communist movement and their agents and so on. But the government was concerned.
One of the most intriguing stories appeared in the American Mercury magazine in 1943. It claimed that Hess flew to Britain on Hitler's orders and that a reception committee was waiting for him at the Duke of Hamilton's private airstrip at his home Dungavel House. It is a story repeated by the latest researchers into the Hess mission. Their version of events comes from two former members of the ATS, the Women's Territorial Army, who claimed they were at Dungavel that night.
Mrs. Abbott basically told me that she was in the kitchen with the other girls, part of the service personnel there, and that having a cup of tea. And one of the girls said, "Oh my goodness, the lights have gone on the airstrip." This was very unusual, because the airstrip was only very, very occasionally used. They went out, and one of them said, "This is very obvious for the German bombers if they're coming in." They saw a lot of people coming and going, and somebody said, "Well, who were all these people?" And nobody seemed to know. They'd been on approximately 10, 15 minutes, and the lights were switched off suddenly. They were left in the dark outside, and a few minutes after the lights had gone off,
they had an aircraft in the vicinity. And it was a couple of days later that they found that Hess had arrived and bailed out over Eaglesham.
Another former member of the ATS told of activity in the outbuildings on the airfield, known as the kennels.
Mrs. Baker was able to confirm Mrs. Abbott's story that the lights had gone on and off. And she also came up with a story which, frankly, I dismissed initially and indeed had to interrupt her to clarify it, because she explained that the Duke was in the kennels with his party and with some Polish officers awaiting the arrival of Hess. I mean, she didn't realise they were awaiting the arrival of Hess until events showed that that was clearly what they were there for. Now, when she said that, I said, well, hold on. I think it's very well established that the Duke was at RAF Turnhouse that evening. So I must challenge you on that. And she said, no, the Duke of Hamilton was at RAF Turnhouse. He was on duty. But the Duke of Kent, I was referring to, he was in the kennels.
The Duke of Kent, the King's younger brother, had worked hard to promote Anglo-German understanding, and in 1939 had proposed that he go on a personal mission to Hitler to try to prevent war.
Kent would have been the logical person to have been meeting him, and would have been the reason, the main reason, why Hess would have had to come to England, or Scotland in this instance, rather than the person negotiating to go abroad, because you could not have had the King's brother at that stage go abroad to negotiate in a neutral country.
The claim of a welcoming committee ready to receive Hess, though not one with a royal leader, had first been made a few weeks after his flight. In 1941, the Lord Provost of Glasgow, Sir Patrick Dolan, had stated that he had information that Hess had come by arrangement with a British group. He had planned to have peace discussions and would then have flown back with fuel supplied by his hosts.
I think it's just complete fiction and not based on hard evidence. What happened was more astonishing than fiction in many respects, and it gave rise to many extraordinary stories.
There may be no conclusive evidence for a welcoming party, but Hess clearly believed that he was going to be met by a powerful delegation, powerful enough to remove Churchill, and perhaps with access to the king himself. Either the plan went badly wrong, or as Stalin always claimed, he was tricked by the British Secret Service and lured to Britain.
What was the purpose of luring him over here if you then didn't make a publicity coup out of it? You know, Hitler balmy says Deputy Führer, who's just fled to Britain. But there was no purpose in luring him here, whereas there was obviously lots of things to be gained by inviting him here. Invite him here, introduce him to all these pro-German and pro-Nazi establishment people, and out of that they hoped that a compromise peace would emerge.
As a young man, Pat Morse served as aide to General Bill Donovan, head of American Special Operations, the OSS.
For Hess to hop in a two-seater plane and run off to England and land over there and get in touch with the local gentry and say, take me to your leader, I want to talk about a peace plan between Great Britain and Germany, it just is not reasonable.
I interviewed Sir Dick Wyatt, the head of British Secret Intelligence Service in the late 80s. And he'd been an intelligence officer during the war, and he knew the whole Hess story back to front. I put to him my theory that Hess had been invited, and he smiled enigmatically, but he didn't deny it. And he was the one who sowed the idea in my mind that the problem for the Germans about Hess was that Hess had arrived too late, and that Churchill had swung the nation, including all these establishment dissidents, behind the war effort. So he said, poor old Hess, he arrived too late.
In Germany, Hitler ordered Hess's name removed from all Nazi publications. His public mood was one of anger, and yet when Hess's father died, he sent his widow a telegram of condolence, hardly the behavior of a Führer who felt betrayed. And his mistress, Eva Braun, helped the Hess family when they came under pressure from his successor, Martin Bormann.
After the flight, Martin Bormann tried to damage our family and to kick us out of the house in Munich. And then my mother received a letter from Eva Braun saying, if you need anything, please inform me, because I'm talking to Hitler without Bormann. Very interesting sentence, huh?
Meanwhile, Rudolf Hess had been moved to Maindif Court in Wales. Here he had a degree of freedom. He visited the village pubs and, according to local folklore, may even have signed this beer label. As a young girl, Eve Criddle lived in a nearby house.
But I particularly remembered all these soldiers appearing with rifles. And Hess came out of the door with a soldier each side. And Hess was a head taller than the soldiers, very tall. And Hess walked down the path towards the lodge and then on into the garden. As he passed me, he half smiled. And on he went, and just wandered around the garden. I saw him wander around the garden a few times after that.
Hess remained in Wales until the end of the war. For 4 years, he had been kept from public view. Then in October 1945, he was back on the front page as he and his former colleagues were reunited at Nuremberg, on trial for war crimes.
You must plead guilty or not guilty.
Nein.
That will be entered as not guilty.
I was as close to Hess when I was going in connection with presenting our briefs to Hess as I am to you. Hess was a composed figure, unlike what has been often portrayed as a flaky guy who was off the wall. There was no evidence of that. He was aware of what was going on.
Throughout the trial, Hess had claimed to be suffering from amnesia. He said he did not recognize Goering, nor Böhler, who had translated the letter to Hamilton, or his old mentor, Karl Haushofer. One man who was deeply suspicious of Hess's amnesia was Allen Dulles. Dulles had been in charge of United States intelligence gathering from inside Germany and would later become director of the CIA. He had a more sensational explanation to offer. He said he had reason to believe that Hess had been secretly executed on Churchill's orders and that the man in the dock was a double. There was an easy way to test Dulles's theory. The prisoner must be examined to see if he bore the bullet wounds Hess suffered in the First World War. But his guards refused to allow the examination to take place. Hess was found not guilty of crimes against humanity, but was sentenced to life imprisonment in Spandau prison in Berlin. It was here in 1973 that Hugh Thomas managed to perform the examination which had eluded Dulles.
I approached him, and he was putting his dressing gown on, so I had a chance to stop him where he was, in good lighting, and stop him in a position where he had his arm uplifted to look in the armpit fold itself, underneath the arm, on the front of the chest, the back of the chest, in the region where I would expect him to have been shot if he'd survived. I found nothing, and I asked him in German, "What's happened to your war wounds?" His reaction was instant. He started to shake, and he ran for the toilet. And he wouldn't speak to me again, ever. So my reaction to that was to then look for the chest x-rays, but there was absolutely nothing to suggest in the x-ray or the pathology that he sustained a gunshot wound. This man was not the recipient of a high-velocity gunshot wound, nor, in fact, of a shrapnel wound in the left arm, that we know that the real Hess also sustained, nor of a wound in the head that he sustained in a riot in Munich.
Hugh Thomas believes that the real Hess was murdered, and it was a double who flew to Britain. Like Thomas, Stephen Pryor and his team believe that a double existed, but they're convinced that Hess ended his mission where it had begun, in Scotland. During the war, there had been persistent rumours linking Hess to Scotland. Churchill had been forced to deny he was imprisoned there in response to questions asked in Parliament, and in 1942 SS intelligence claimed Hess was being held at a villa in Scotland.
When I subsequently spoke to the late Lord Thurso about it, he also said this was common currency, common parlance at the time. He had no knowledge of it, but his mother had told him there was the rumour. Now, that was only 9 miles away from where they lived, the Braymore Lodge, from where the Thursos lived.
But how could Hess be in Scotland while being held at Maindif Court in Wales? Pryor believes that a double lived at the lightly guarded Maindif, while the real Hess was secure in Scotland, and that it was here that Hess's path once again crossed that of the Duke of Kent, with tragic consequences. The Duke of Kent was the King's brother and the only member of the royal family to die in active service during the Second World War. His memorial is a simple stone cross amid the isolated mountains of Caithness at the northern tip of Scotland. Kent died when a Sunderland flying boat in which he was a passenger crashed into these Scottish mountains in the summer of 1942. He was supposedly en route to Iceland, but while Kent took off at 1:10 in the afternoon, the crash was not recorded as having happened until 2 o'clock. Nearly an hour, when the distance travelled would only have involved a flying time of 20 minutes. The official report gave the cause of the accident as the pilot having deviated from his flight plan and flying too low. But where were Kent and the Sunderland crew during the missing time?
In order to explain the missing 30 to 40 minutes, we've got to find somewhere that he can have landed. Now, the only place that we've got here, and strangely enough it is owned by the then Minister of Air, Sir Archibald Sinclair, is Loch Moor.
Pryor and his team believed that the Sunderland was off course because it had landed to pick up Hess, who was waiting for them in a cottage at the edge of Loch Moor. They say the plan was to take him to neutral Sweden to discuss peace and then repatriate him. The flying boat flew a course designed to avoid surrounding high peaks, but narrowly failed to clear the mountain barrier at the far end of the loch and crashed on Eagle's Rock. There were 15 passengers and crew on board the plane. After the crash, an RAF team removed the bodies and the Air Ministry reported no survivors, but the following day, one of the crew, the tail gunner, Andy Jack, staggered to a farmer's cottage having spent the night on the moors. His survival meant there had been 16 on board.
And the question then is Hess the extra body on the Sunderland?
For Wolf Hess, the answer is no. Still living today in the village which was his father's mountain retreat, he rejects all suggestions that the man in Spandau was not his father.
It's very clear for me that my father flew personally to Britain or to Scotland, and he's the man who was in Nuremberg and in Spandau, and all the other theories are nonsense.
Spandau's prisoner number 7 refused visits from his family until 1969, 28 years after he had said goodbye and flown off. But even then, any mention of his peace mission was forbidden.
Never ever I was allowed to discuss these things with my father, because the time between 33 and 45 were completely off the record in Spandau.
Why was that?
I don't know, you have to ask the Allies.
The visits continued until on the 17th of August 1987, Rudolf Hess was found dead in his cell. He had apparently committed suicide by hanging, by tying a piece of electrical cord around his neck, knotting it to a window frame, and then falling off his chair. To this day, Wolf Hess is convinced his father was murdered.
You know, we made the family ask for a second autopsy, which was carried out in Munich by the very well-known pathologist Professor Spann. And he made pictures of his autopsy, and the pictures, I think the best is if you look at them, and then you can see that there's a completely horizontal mark on the neck, and this doesn't fit into the official version that he hanged himself.
Why do I believe it is murder? Why do 80% of the German pathologists that advised Dr. Spann and Dr. Spann himself believe it is murder? Why does Scotland Yard, Chief Superintendent Howard Jones, believe it is murder? Their report deliberately hasn't been made public. Well, the basis is again very simple. But the indentation on the back of the neck that was made as a result of the ligature was purely transverse, which would mean, in essence, the first horizontal hanging in history. And if you combine that with the mark on the front of the neck and the horizontal mark in the back, it can only mean that the chances were that this was strangulation.
The combination of official secrecy, the real doubts about just how he died, and the profusion of conspiracy theories have only served to obscure the real purpose of the Hess mission.
Why was Hess never permitted to be interviewed? Why was he sealed up in a prison for years and years and years when he really had quite a story to tell? Here was a blockbuster of a story.
The Hess mission doesn't make any sense at all if you take it as an isolated one-off affair. It looks utterly bizarre and stupid. However, if you see it as part of a long process by which elements in Britain and Germany tried to make a deal with each other to stop the war happening or to bring it to a conclusion once it had started, once you realise that the Hess mission was actually the last throw of the dice in that long battle, in that long game, it makes much more sense.
The failure of the Hess mission coincided with a change in Hitler's fortunes. Before it, not much had gone wrong for him. After it, hardly anything seemed to go right. Hess's circle fared badly. Albrecht Haushofer became involved in the German resistance to Hitler and was shot by the SS just days before the end of the war. His father Karl and mother Martha committed suicide shortly afterwards. Of those in Germany who knew the truth about his flight, only Hess remained to live on in captivity and silence.